Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. Now, all of us can claim to have changed people's lives for the better through the work that we do, but none more so than my guest today. When a 13-year-old from somewhere across the world wrote to Joe Aggarwal about how Wysa was helping her hold on to her life, it reaffirmed the impact that Joe sought to cause in the world through her mental health startup, Wysa. Since then, Wysa has grown to over 3 million users across the world, and they have a phenomenal rating of almost 4.9. And recently, they won the Google Best of 2020 award for apps. In fact, Google may be investing in them as well. Jo spoke about her journey of building a mental health startup, how she has designed the product to be helpful but not diagnostic or prescriptive, how they're using AI to improve use cases, how they're solving the complex and very tricky problem of growth and monetization, and future plans of going from 3 to 50 million users and what they're doing to achieve that. This was a memorable conversation, certainly one that I won't forget very easily. There's plenty of inspiration in here on persevering against the odds, plenty of insights on building thoughtfully. So I hope you like it. Hi, Joe. Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Roshan. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Joe, so to begin things, maybe you could tell us about how you got started with Wysa and how your journey has been thus far.
Sure. So Ramakant and I, my co-founder, is also my partner in life. We've we've sort of left the corporate world in 2009 and joined a founding team of a nonprofit. And in that, I was doing a lot of tech for good innovation. So I was doing a lot of products to try to solve big global problems. And we had a lot of money, we had a lot of influence. And I think by the end of it, 6 years, we were trying to solve for terrorism during the Arab Spring, big problems. And it was, do what you need to. And eventually I walked out of there realizing that the power of the mobile, this was around 2012, 2013, just realizing that the power of the mobile is going to completely transform how we can change the world. That by putting something in the hands of the user, you bypass the need for influence, you bypass the need for lots of money, and you have this permissionless impact, which really caught my imagination. And at some point, Ramakant and I were like, there has to be some level of, okay, now we have enough money, now we'll do what we want. And we were trying to figure out what to do and doing our own startup. And in that startup, we were trying to do something for elder care that was very close to our heart. And using AI for social good was very close to our heart. So we were doing AI, detecting how somebody was, letting their family members know when they need to call their mom, for instance, and take care of them. It was a product that I think did not find product market fit, primarily because everybody wanted to be the caregiver. Nobody wanted to be cared for like that. Um, and everybody conceptually said it's great, and the take up was really poor. And by the time we realized that, that was a week after we'd raised our money, and it actually hit the bank. And as any founder would know, you start raising, and then by the time it hits the bank, 7-8 months have gone by. And by the time it hit the bank, I knew there was no product market fit. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to run a company selling stories. I'd never done that in my corporate life. I didn't want to do that now in my own company, which I didn't believe. I didn't want to be that person who gave back money a week after raising it. So I went into depression and this sort of values conflict. And in that depression, I learned a lot about mental health. I learned, there's a lot of talk about stigma. I don't think I had stigma, but there are many other reasons why we don't get access to support. Um, One very simple one is that when you're depressed is the last time when you have enough energy to actually find a therapist. And the people around you also, you have to really decompensate a lot. As long as you're somehow, managing to keep up appearances, they're not going to go out and try to find your therapist. And
Right.
for 2 months, I've found it hard to have a bath, get out of bed. And one thing that's really easy to do is Google this stuff. So I used up all free resources and some paid resources out there, online therapy, free chat, all of that. And the product brain doesn't switch off, right? There's a part of the confidence goes away. The product brain doesn't switch off. So the product brain's thinking I could do this better. That's how they need to do it. This is not working for a user. Why do I need to be given 1 hour lecture on, how our thoughts work before you even ask me what I'm feeling? Things like that. And saying, oh my God, these things really work. So by the end of it, I had got this clarity that I wanted to solve for mental health. And I was ready to fail doing that. But that was something that I felt like I could get out of bed and do. So we went back to our investors and said, we're going to pivot the company into mental health. And they said, okay, that's fine, as long as you're putting your time. And we started detecting depression with the AI that we had, which worked quite well, except we didn't think it would solve the problem. And I started playing around with this first version of Wysa. It took us 3 months to build. It was just a side experiment. And we had a lot of fun just playing around with it, because everybody, even who are building it, sort of would say, I remember 3 months of trying to get Ramakant to complete a cognitive restructuring exercise. And he'd just be like, no, I'm feeling judged. I'm feeling judged. I'm not going to rethink this thought. And he was the hardest one to convince. And by the end of it, he was like, okay, that actually felt good. I have, and we were trying to get him to reframe the thought of bad traffic in Bangalore, like how he hates driving in Bangalore. So like, by the time he reframed that thought, we're like, okay, we think we can go live now. That it was a side project until it took off. I mean, Wysa, it just happened to us, I guess.
Right. That's one of the most interesting starts to any founding journey that I've heard. Right. And a couple of things I want to pick up on. You mentioned permissionless impact. I mean, that sounds like a super interesting phrase. I wonder if you could like delve a little bit more on that. And also, I would love for you to talk about what it was like post fundraise, right? I mean, here is you've raised a bunch of money on a particular idea and then going back to the investors and saying, hey, you know what, thank you for the money, but then I think we're going to go in this other direction, right?
Exactly.
So what was that like? So if you could talk about both these aspects.
Well, I think this, I'll take the second one first, because I think there's a reason angels are called angels. This was an angel round. And they had kept telling us that we are funding you, we believe in you. And the idea, of course, will evolve, but, we believe in you. And therefore, it felt really bad to be giving back their money, because it meant that I wasn't somebody that they should be believing in. But going back to them, and they just turned around and to an investor, and there were a bunch of these angels, about 10 of them. And each one of them, we called them up and we said, you can take your money if you want, but we are going to be going in this direction. And each of them said, you're investing far more than we are. You're quitting your job, you're putting this time on the line. As long as you're willing to invest that, we're willing to invest this. And I think that was one of the most defining moments for me, because from that point onwards, I was prepared to fail. And I think as an entrepreneur, you have to let go of that fear of failure, fear of letting people down, so that you can actually truly jump off that cliff. And I think from that moment onwards, I felt that I had support,
Right.
that I could, try big things.
Right. No, that's a very interesting point again, right? Because oftentimes early stage investments are based on the founder themselves, and a founder can sort of fall into the trap of, okay, I mean, I need this validation, or I need to prove these people right, and often diverge from the product or the vision of the company itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You tend to seek validation from the story that you told,
Yeah.
rather than listen to the market and then do what it takes to be successful. And I think that's what differentiates a company that's resilient from one that's not. And we nearly were not. I
Right.
mean, and I think you had another question around permissionless impact. So
Yeah.
if I can just take us there.
Sure.
Um, I think permissionless is for me a very strong word in any kind of impact that we do. Permissionless means that there are two words that I value greatly in my life. One is permissionless and another is self-efficacy, which is my confidence in my ability to achieve my goals. I feel like every impact that we do has to be increasing the user's self-efficacy, their confidence in their ability to achieve their goals, not our goals. And ideally, it should be permissionless, because then that user does not have to be, because my parents said I could get it, because my employer offered it to me, because some NGO decided to enlist me in a program, because some healthcare provider decided. So there are all these permissions that access happens. But for me, the Play Store, the App Store are very permissionless. Anybody, wherever they are in the world, as long as they have a phone, they have permission to Google something, find something, go on the App Store, get it, use it. And that gives them confidence in their ability to achieve their goals. Because that impact that you can achieve where somebody needs nothing. And therefore, Wysa will always have one layer that's free, that anybody can use it. And if somebody is talking to Wysa and finds that they need a particular tool, that tool just appears within Wysa for them. It's only the premium tool pack ranges and the therapists that we gate with a cost. But that permissionless social impact that we could potentially achieve was a dream initially. And there's still a lot of imposter syndrome. So still a lot of, I have sold the story, I have made this impact happen, but did it really happen? Because until you go direct to consumer, you don't really understand what impact you have. Because you'll have these 5 stories that somebody tells you. And it's very different when you're direct to consumer in a space like ours. Because we put it out there, it had got taken up, like we had 30,000 users a month before we knew it. And we have now 3 million users and we have no paid marketing so far. So that take up was definitely validating, but we didn't know whether people were playing around with the AI, because it's a cool thing to play with a chatbot and, it's fun and it's a game. So then this 13-year-old writes to us and says, a girl from the US, she says, I'm 13. I tried to commit suicide and I was depressed, and you're helping me hold on to my life. She said, you're helping me hold on to myself. I remember it was May in 2017 when we got this, where you report issues on an app. And Ramakant and I were just cried. And at that point, I think now we have 107 such mails from different people. But that just took care of the imposter syndrome right there. At that point, it's, you start saying, okay, I can fail, and saying, I have a chance of success. And if I have a chance of success, then I'll do what it takes. And from that point onwards, it was just, okay, we're going to keep this real. We're going to make this story. Make sure we don't sell stories. We don't lose track of what we're trying to do, but we are going to create something that the world has never seen.
This episode is brought to you by Mulya. You want to move fast? Sure. But without breaking things? Now that's a hard ask. The thing is, once you have some base of users and customers, you just cannot afford to risk quality. So how do the likes of Cred, Swiggy and CureFit, some of India's fastest growing startups, ship at lightning pace and delight their users and customers? Simple, they're working with Mulya as a strategic quality partner. Mulya is India's most talented and passionate community of testers. They've helped prevent thousands of bugs and regression issues. So as a CTO or a product owner, if you want to reduce tech debt, especially while you scale, do check out mulya.com. I've interviewed Mulya's founder and CEO Pradeep on the podcast earlier, and we spoke about how startups can improve quality while scaling and things to that effect. You should definitely check it out. I'll link to it in the description below. Now back to your regular programming. Right. Yeah, that's like peak validation, right? I mean, your product is so important to someone. I would love to understand more about Wysa, but before we move on to that, just from everything that you've said so far, right, in terms of, your initial hypothesis and then raising money and then realizing that, the need for a pivot and then, having the conviction to go forward, from everything so far, if you were to abstract yourself away from that situation and kind of look at it and give 2 or 3 pieces of advice to founders who may have seen that circumstance or will see that circumstance, what is that piece of advice?
One advice I think people also gave me. So these are some advice that I got. 2 pieces, I'll share those, which I thought were great pieces of advice that greatly helped me. Some which I wasn't ready to hear when I heard it, but then I had to arrive at it myself. And so first is, of course, not seeking validation. So there's a tendency that no matter how experienced you are, when you put your startup out there, you're very interested in validation. You're very interested in saying, oh, so and so likes it, so that itself is enough. Or trying to tweak your story so that somebody would validate it. And that's the surest path to the only validation you need is in the hands of the market, in the hands of the product, right? The product market fit is the only validation you need. And we tend to get seduced by so many proxy validations, from accelerators to this award to that person agreeing to join us. Oh, we hired an ex-Flipkart guy, or to even so-and-so agreeing to invest in us. But really keeping it down to the product market fit and not allowing yourself to be seduced by any other validation except product market fit for as long as you can. Let everything else be about, like, you need the money, you get the money. Don't use it for validation. You need space, you get the space. Don't use it for validation. Product market fit is the only validation. That's the one point. Number two, I think Sandeep Singhal from Westbridge told me this, and it really changed how I designed the product. He said a startup or a product is not prose, it's poetry. So a lot of intelligent people try to do this and this and this and this and try to come up with a comprehensive approach to the problem. You need to write one line that's going to be on everyone's lips. It has to be that simple and that powerful. So even now, when I advise startups, I say, get rid of every and in your pitch. So, you think it's adding value, it's losing you value. So we do this and this and this means you're confused. So what is that one thing that you do really well? And really bring it down to poetry and do that well. And then successful companies, of course, keep adding ands over time. But that's those are the two things that I would say. I won't go to a third. I think a third that I realized for myself, at least, was that for me to grow, I had to be comfortable being wrong. That discomfort that one has. So I actually went through a whole year of giving myself a good every time I was wrong. To sort of reframed my brain. But I think that's personal to everybody. That was a learning I needed to have.
Right.
But these two, I think, are generic that I think everybody can use.
Yeah. So one of the questions you asked on a previous talk really, resonated with me, which is that if you are guaranteed to fail, then what will you do, right?
Yes.
That's a fantastic question, because it really puts things in perspective. I mean, you start off by being so micro, and then you really realize that, okay, you know what? If I'm guaranteed to fail anyway, why not take a nice big swing at a really big problem, right? So
Exactly. I
yeah,
mean, 99% of the startups fail, right?
yeah,
And we sort of, nobody assumes that they're going to be that 99%. But 99% startup failing is kind of guaranteed to fail. And if you try to solve a bigger problem, the chances of failure seem bigger. So, but at the same time, if you were guaranteed to fail, that's how, for me, in my depression, I felt. In my imposter syndrome, I just felt that no matter what I would do, I would fail. I had no business leading people. And at one point, I thought, if I'm guaranteed to fail, then also I have to do something. I can't just lie in bed. And,
right.
what would I do? And I think of everybody who's working on climate change, ecology. They're doing all of that knowing that, the earth is probably now irrevocably headed towards a crisis, and still they're doing it because that's what they want to do in life. And I think that changes your perspective. Once
Right.
you're in that zone, you only want to do it right.
Right.
You stop seeking validation from others. You start seeking validation from the fact that what I'm doing is actually, going to change mental health, for instance, for me.
Right. So that is a fantastic background to sort of set us up for a conversation on Wysa. For those of us who don't know what Wysa is, what is Wysa? If you could talk us through some of the use cases that you serve, the pivots that you've been through, and so on, that would be amazing.
Absolutely. The Wysa, so let's talk about the problem that it solves to begin with. The problem that we have today, I believe, in mental health is that we either have medicalization of mental health. So people will tell you something like 1 in 4 people will suffer from a depression or anxiety or a mental health illness in their life, or you have meditation and yoga. So there'll be all these wellness apps, the Headspaces, the Calms of the world, and it will be all about that. While we can tell now from our own data, from 100 million conversations that Wysa has had, that about 60% of the working age population and a larger portion of the younger population actually wants to help themselves, but mindfulness and yoga are not enough because they're not in that state where they can do it. And medicalization is not something that they are ready for. Even if they are seeing a therapist, it's not there for them at 4 a.m. when they are actually dealing with these negative thoughts that are not getting out of their head and they desperately need to. So this missing middle of help for somebody in a way that listens to them. And it's really a few things: feeling heard and validated. It's being able to depersonalize whatever is stressing you out. So whatever the stressors are, depersonalize them, not about me, not about somebody else. Then controlling the controllables, reframing negative thoughts. These are very basic things like problem solving. To be able to do that, to be able to even feel heard and validated in a safe space at 4 a.m. when you're anxious with thoughts that you don't want to share with anybody else, you have to medicalize and go to a therapist. There isn't a space. And people say, are we trying to replace therapists? Wysa, of course, is an AI bot that gives you that safe space and is written by therapists with AI guiding it so that it feels like a real conversation. But people ask us whether we're trying to replace therapists, and I often ask them back, what business do therapists have being that person that we talk to at 4 a.m.? We are really talking to our own head. And if we can give them some kind of a foil, like a journal that helps them with that conversation inside their own head, this is much more fit for purpose, appropriate for what a person needs. So Wysa is really that really light, safe space where you can work on your own mental health. Think of it like a gym. So there's like an AI guided trainer. So you sort of, it's asking you questions and you're answering those questions, but in a way, it's creating this image in your head that you're actually feeling heard. You're not feeling judged. It's completely anonymous. It's completely private. Nobody knows who you are. It's not even a peer support. It's just, there's nobody. And this is your space to work through everything. And some things work very well, some things don't. So things like reframing a negative thought works beautifully. It takes 10 minutes to do in Wysa. With a therapist, it can take 3 sessions. So some things we've realized that people end up doing just much better when they can work on it in their own pace. And some things, of course, where you have to have more accountability to somebody, where problem solving is harder on an AI bot because your mind is often going in the same direction and it's not able to generate alternatives. Sometimes working with another person is much better when you're trying to problem solve. But in all of this, even getting to a stage where you want to talk to another person, having that confidence that you've done what you can yourself has been very empowering to people.
Right. So before we delve into some of the product nuances, could you also briefly touch upon some of the milestones that you've hit upon the way? I mean, like your users, and I think recently, I mean, you got funded by the Google Assistant folks as well, right? So yeah.
So I mean, big milestones. I think for us, the first milestone was the email from the 13-year-old girl.
Right.
The next milestone, we raised a few rounds of funding, but I think bigger milestone was meeting Emma in the NHS in the UK. She found us at a conference because she had been using Wysa for a year and a half before she found us with children and adolescents, so 13 plus years of age. And she said in that age group, 13 to 18, nothing worked. So she would have these long wait lists and people waiting to see a therapist, and she could give them nothing else. But when she gave them Wysa, a third of them didn't need anything else. And hearing that from a mental health nurse who is trying to find solutions, and she said just using Wysa made her realize the power of technology, and she'd now become a digital health pioneer for the NHS, won multiple awards for her work. So just seeing that belief directly from a practitioner, we said, so how can we help you? And she said, you need to do these things differently. And that was a huge milestone because that got us into clinical safety, efficacy, publishing research, making sure that clinicians can adopt us. And since then, we've had these 2 pillars of Wysa. We're #1 on Google Play. We were App of the Year last year. We're also the #1 clinically approved app by the National Health Service in the UK. Also in Singapore, we've been, the Ministry of Health in Singapore tried out every app and technology in this space. And in the pilots, we came out best. So we've been offered to all of Singapore. We have partners. large institutions in the US who are now adopting us. So there, it's been about clinical safety, privacy. We've just got ISO 27001, 27701 certification. So we're starting to look like a very serious player in the healthcare industry and putting all of those in place without compromising the user experience. And on the user experience, I think the big milestone for us was actually we went to Google Launchpad. And as a part of Google Launchpad, we began to understand how to crack the ASO. So we've always been organic. And then we did a whole experiment in trying to do marketing, and we were not the company who would do a negative CAC to LTV. So cost of customer acquisition being higher than the long-term value of the person was just, that's not us. So we tried it, we stopped it, and then we stayed organic. But the problem with organic is you don't know, when your app will just stop being used. So I think that was a big milestone, understanding ASO, having a consultant who worked with us. That's been invaluable. And then being able to monetize. So we were always scared of monetizing. And finally, we sort of built a growth team some things that startups do on day one, we took 3 years to do. Because there was always this conflict that how do you tell somebody who's really upset that we want them to pay? But we bit the bullet, we put our prices at a certain level. We said, okay, we're going to give free trials, and then so many people will convert, etc. So we started monetizing, and then at least the B2C app was more than self-sustaining. That gave us the confidence that, okay, this social impact is not going to go away, and we can go after everything. And then COVID happened. And, this was the time when we were also talking to Google Assistant, and everybody wanted to do something with us. But post-COVID, we've added 10 healthcare clients, employers. Accenture's taken us global. We went head to head with Headspace, and we got, global Accenture. It's like this tiny company, Wysa, right? And so lots of these, I think, opportunities that have come to us and have validated that this is probably our time. This is when it's going to go big. I don't know that we're there yet. I think there'll be many milestones in the next 1 to 2 years that will probably overshadow the rest of the story. But so far, so good.
Awesome. Yeah, that's more than a few very important milestones I think you've hit. So let's talk about the product itself. It strikes me as a very complex problem to solve, because I was just thinking about it, right? Neither can you be diagnostic and say, hey, you know what, this is what is wrong with you, nor can you be prescriptive and say that, what, you have to do these X, Y, and Z things. And without doing either of these, I mean, for an app to be helpful is, I couldn't wrap my head around it, right? So it's a very complex problem that you're solving. Can you take us through some of the principles in terms of your
Yes,
problem solving as such?
Absolutely. That's exactly the problem we're trying to solve. And you're absolutely right. We can't be either of those two, and we can also not be assertive. And that is one of the hardest things to be. So you cannot tell a person, we learned that early on, even in our first user reviews, you cannot tell in Wysa. You can't tell them this works. You can't tell them, not just because of medical reasons, but people want to be heard and validated. So you have to work with people across 65 countries, across different cultures, different beliefs, and you have to have something that works for all of them. And so the power of empathetic listening is something that we had to bring into Wysa. And we had a lot of problem-solving ideas that we brought to it. For instance, we found that line drawings as a graphic style works very well. So when we would say good to somebody, Wysa saying you did really well would not be as impactful as having a nice GIF. We found some really nice GIFs from Cheebird that we then, agreed with Cheebird that we'd use with sort of approval from them, and we'd give links back to them. And we started out there, and then we started building our own GIFs around that similar style. We started experimenting with just questions. What questions do you ask to get somebody to open up? And we broke it up into really 3 parts of Wysa. The first is the feel heard and validated. And that was also the context gathering. So you just keep asking questions. And for the longest time, we'd have like far too many of the tell me mores. And people would be like, this is repetitive. And they never actually get to the technique. So we learned how to actually make a person feel heard by repeating what they said back to them, by taking long sentences, breaking it up to the constituent parts, realizing that somebody said something about diabetes, somebody said something about a breakup, creating prepends on the question that we would have around that, and creating a statement that felt magical, felt like somebody had actually heard you. So we had to break it up into acknowledging what a person said and asking the question, which was the next path in the therapeutic technique, and sort of assembling it in a way that worked. So that's a lot of iterations. There are over 300 like iterations of Wysa that have happened in the last 3 years, that we've done. And the model we used was the objection model and our business intelligence engine that measures drop-offs. So our objection model tells us when people are objecting, you're not listening to me, that's not working, I don't want to do this. And of course, they vote with their feet and they drop off. So out of all these conversations, we'd just get that analysis and we'd have an insight like a person who is angry at somebody else, especially for cheating on them, is not likely to want to restructure a negative thought if presented in the way that we're currently doing. So we had to do many iterations and we finally got to a stage where we were saying, do you want to get back some power in this situation? Do you want to get back control? And then they were like, okay, and they would start restructuring the negative thought rather than saying this thought is making you feel upset because they really wanted to feel upset. So they felt very justified. So lots of insights. In fact, I was just talking to our clinical content lead today, a psychologist, that we should start publishing in Science some of these insights we've had on what works in self-care, because we see ourselves as this largest experiment in co-design of mental health, where we have our therapists on the one hand saying this should work, and our sort of content writers writing it up with the AI, and then users coming back and saying this part doesn't work, that part doesn't work, and us reiterating it.
Again, I mean, your product funnels must look like really complicated, right? Because if you look at it, these folks are having unstructured conversations. I mean, it's not so straightforward as, okay, a person comes to a particular landing page, then, picks a particular product, and then, adds maybe a couple of others and then drops off at some point. And then you realize you're able to sort of triangulate and say, hey, what, possibly we can eliminate this friction or this other thing in this process as such. But with Wysa, I mean, a person is having unstructured conversations, right? And each person may come in from a different perspective. Someone's having a breakup, someone could have a medical issue, someone could be a male, in India of a certain age, someone could be something else. Again, I'm not able to wrap my head around how you sort of have cohorts, and how do you study user behavior and engagement and come up with things that will be generally applicable to the users.
So there are two parts of Wysa. There's a team that works on the app, which does growth on a very similar level that everybody else has a product funnel, which is, what did we say? Did they convert? Did they actually go on and actually take up therapy or take up Wysa and so on, which is the screen-based work. And then there is what we call Wysa Core, which is the bot-based work. And bot-based work works on iterations of understanding where drop-offs are happening, what are the similarities, so a lot of analysis, like, this point, all the people who are dropping off out of that unstructured conversation using AI to extract patterns. So like people who cheated on them, when we don't even have a model to detect that, and then later developing a model to detect that, oh, somebody cheated, and therefore adding that model into Wysa. Those are the iterations that happen, right? You get an insight, then you develop a hypothesis, then you develop a product idea, you roll it out, and many, many times it makes zero difference on take up, drop-offs, because that thing never got surfaced because the problem was somewhere higher in the funnel or something else. So we've had to learn how to, focus our efforts. And I think there was no playbook for it. So we had to develop it ourselves.
Yeah.
But it's been very rewarding. because it also creates an entry barrier. We're the only people today who have an AI that can allow free text for most of it. So there's Wobot and Uber, but most of it is not free text. So they have very specific things that you can say to it. And so we allow free text, but we are also clinically safe. And being able to combine these two gives us a lot of power in healthcare implementations like triage and escalation to the right path if they need it, and so on. So all that work has actually given us a great competitive advantage today.
Right. Could you talk about some of the work that you do with artificial intelligence, right? Because AI has a bad rep all the time. I mean, people imagine, rogue robots or like, doomsday scenarios that have been painted by all of the Hollywood movies. But here at Wysa, you're employing AI that is compassionate and benevolent and actually helping people, right? Could you talk about how AI works at Wysa?
Sure. I wouldn't say compassionate and benevolent. I'd definitely say explainable. So I keep it as simple as that, right? That the AI that I would trust is an AI that's explainable. Because the moment you put a black box in there, then there is a possibility that things are happening which you have no control over. So we try to keep ourselves, it's natural language programming. And out of the natural language programming, you have understanding and generation as the broad two categories. So 90% of Wysa's AI is NLU, natural language understanding, which tends to be highly explainable. So there are various models, word to vec, till bird, you have all these different models from different generations of AI, but all of them are basically trying to classify what a person has said in free text on various parameters. The big secret sauce in Wysa is in figuring out what parameters you need to classify conversations on so that it can plug straight into what a therapist would tell you to do next. The writing of Wysa is all done by therapists, except the prepends. So the questions, the next step, the rule engine that says what you should do next is all therapists, right? And it's gone through clinical review, it's gone through user review, it's gone through all of that. So that's like a decision tree. But to make you feel heard, what we'll do is we'll take parts of what you've said and sometimes replay it back to you, sometimes say a sentence that is acknowledging what you said. Like, it can be really hard to live with diabetes. You're dealing with all these other things, but also on top of it, diabetes must be making it worse. And I can only imagine what you're doing. Just something that makes you feel like you're having a real conversation that reacted to what you said that's not generic. So that again is not very explainable because we use parts of what a person said and we sort of play it back to them, etc. The idea is to create the effect, not to focus on how cool the AI is going to be. So we will be, we'll be very shameless and use like keyword-based models, still the highest AI models, and it's absolutely fine. Whatever works eventually to give the most appropriate response, the most helpful response. That's how we do it. So we always kept AI as in its sort of in its ability to serve the user, and we've always kept the user in the forefront. And what
It's a means to an end, basically.
It's a means to an end, and sometimes the problem is solved by changing content, not even using AI.
Right.
So we don't assume that, we, in fact, early in our existence, we were doing much cooler AI than we are today. So when we were doing elder care, we were using AI to detect how somebody is. Then we were using AI to detect whether somebody is depressed and doing it with a 90% accuracy. So with the sensor data from a phone, that's a lot of really cool AI that's diagnostic and all of that stuff. And to us, it wasn't solving the problem. So solving the problem has always been at the forefront. We just found that, while we had detected 30 people in our first trial as being clinically depressed, and then the doctor tried to get them therapy, and one person took therapy, everybody else was prescribed Valium. And we were like, we're not going to be the reason why antidepressants get prescribed to a lot more people. And so we just stopped that, right? We're trying to solve the problem now. And that was the willingness to fail that, I talked about earlier, like willingness to fail, but not going to change the problem statement. And this works. So whatever AI it takes to make it work, and no more and no less.
Right, right. So, there's a lot of stigma associated with mental health issues and depression and so on and so forth. You brought up a fact, right? I mean, 1 in 4 people could potentially suffer from some sort of a mental illness, but only a tiny fraction out of that will even realize that there is such a thing, and then and a tinier fraction of them will actually seek help. So there's a lot of friction in that. I wonder, how you are solving for that friction, how you're making it more seamless. You mentioned, it's easier to talk to a bot, for example, right? People may not feel judged as such, and plus all of the product nuances that you spoke about in terms of making it more congenial for someone to have that conversation with, right? There's also the aspect of privacy and safety and all of that. You are getting someone to open up their deepest, possibly their darkest thoughts and whatever, right? How do you inspire confidence in your users?
There are a few questions in there. Let me take them one by one.
Sure.
So I'll first take the question around the privacy and confidence. Let me just take that because that's an easier one to answer. So the privacy and confidence from a user perspective is simply by never asking them for any personal information. So no email, no phone number, and we tell them that, I don't need to know who you are, make up a nickname and start talking to Wysa. And just that simplicity and the right questions that Wysa asks, we find that within 3 or 4 questions, people start opening up. Because these are like journal prompt questions. What about that made you feel angry? Just tell me how you're feeling right now. And if you say I'm anxious, what about it? And after a point, people start opening up. So that we've iterated enough on that listening part of Wysa to make sure that people are able to open up. And from a security perspective, the ISO, the end-to-end encryption, all of that, we make sure that we do the privacy policies very, very strict. And that we will, I remember on one bot I'd written that, how old are you for a user, just as a part of that bot. And 16 different people in Wysa came back to me and said, we can't ask age, that might be PII, that might be personally identifiable information. It wasn't, but there was such a culture of don't ever put anything that causes a user to share personally identifiable information. And even if they inadvertently share it, our AI team has a model that will detect it and redact it from our service. So there's that sense of privacy. Now, we don't have to tell a user all this. We often have to tell our B2B clients all this and they'll audit us. But from a user perspective, just the fact that they are not, we're not asking them who they are generally creates trust. The stigma that you talked about is about the illness. The stigma is also about appearing weak. The stigma or the sense of heaviness that the concept of being depressed and anxious or seeing a therapist gives you, it becomes a thing. I don't know how better to put it, right? And we want to make it not a thing. So I don't want it to be like, okay, this is one more thing. And especially when you're already sort of feeling crushed under the weight of all the stuff, all the stressors in your life, you don't want it to be another stressor. And therefore, we just took the diagnosis, the illness out of the equation. Nobody needs to be using Wysa because they're unhappy or diagnosed or any of that stuff or weak. This is about giving you the power to solve it. Now, what do most people say when they say that I don't need a therapist or I don't need to? They say, I can do this myself. That's where they're starting from. So we just reframed it and we said, okay, what is the goal eventually? It is to solve for mental health. What is the user's goal? The user's goal is to solve it for themselves. So we're calling it stigma because we're sitting really far from them. But if we sat as a user, and I had been a user, so I would be like, okay, I need to solve this myself. I need to get the confidence that I can beat this so that I get better. And if I can give them tools that helps them solve it themselves, they actually get enough confidence to seek therapy because they could at least walk those first 5 steps. And they also get a sense of what therapy will do. They also get frustrated with Wysa because it gets repetitive and they're like, I need a real person. And at that point, they're like, okay, I need a therapist.
Right. And also, I think, therapy, at least in the physical world, is such a person-dependent thing also, right? I mean, the odds of finding someone who would kind of suit your temperament or where you are in life and what problem you're trying to solve as well is a bit of a lottery. I've realized that in my own experience, right? I mean, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I guess that also is solved by something like what you're trying to do. Uh,
I think one thing I want to say is that we had to add therapists to Wysa
right.
because we realized that AI by itself will not do, and we ended up getting we hire 1 in 50 therapists who apply to us, and we do text-based therapy. So it's very hard to do a great therapeutic relationship on text, but for those therapists who can do it, they can create amazing impact, and it still preserves that sense of privacy and security in the user. So for somebody who's not yet ready to have an audio video chat with a therapist and build that relationship, they can sort of go in and they can swap therapists if they're not working. But most often we find like 100% of people who use a therapist feel like this was amazing value, because um, that match of a therapist who's willing to flex to you
Mm.
is and is able to do it lightly over text, and be there for you every day rather than once in 2 weeks, is a very different model. So even that we've iterated quite a bit to say, again, from where the user is, what their concerns are. We won't call it stigma, we just call it their concerns, right? How do you make even therapy that much more accessible from both a cost and just how it integrates with their life
Right.
perspective.
Right. You mentioned that letter from the 13-year-old girl, right?
Yeah.
I was curious. I mean, any other things that people have said, that users have said, that kind of caught you by surprise and swung you in a different way altogether than previously what you were considering?
I think always our users have articulated to us what we are doing better than we can articulate back to them. So, and I think our best way of motivating the team, how we work, is that every user reviews come straight into a Slack channel on Wysa, and everybody starts their day by reading about 100 reviews, and there'll be conversation on those reviews, both good and bad. So there'll be sometimes something is not working for a particular type of user, and it would just start a conversation within Wysa saying, what can we do? Or mostly we have a 4.9 rating, so most of those are really good reviews. And we'll have people saying how it's transformed their life. Uh, Various things have been really impactful. So um, we worked with one of the largest healthcare providers in the US, and they told us stories of two of their nurses and clinical professionals, especially during COVID, under a lot of stress. One of them was perpetually with EAP, so would be in crisis every week and calling EAP every other day. And another would never, seek any help. And they told us stories of both of these. So the first one actually did not come to EAP for 2 weeks. And when she called, they said, so you've not been around, and, are things better? And she said, no, last week was the worst week ever, but I sorted it out with a penguin. And just that sense that, folks who are dealing with some serious stuff, like day in, day out, are still able to get that support. And similarly, I always get impressed when clinical staff use it. So in the UK, we heard stories of a group of paramedics where one of them had actually tried to commit suicide, and all of them were under that stress. And it tends to be contagious, that feeling of hopelessness, that when one of you starts to give up. And they started using Wysa as a group and started, that really worked for them. So those stories have been really powerful. And for somebody else who, the other nurse who had never used it, she turned around to them and said, this is the first time you've given me something I can use, because I never think my troubles are big enough to take to anybody. I never know when they're big enough. So now I have a place I'm comfortable talking. And that's sort of a lot of users. Lots of people who just think of it as a friend. There are folks in Japan who use it to learn English. So you'll never know what they end up using it for. But yeah, 107 people writing to us to say it saved their life. That makes all the difference.
Fantastic. So I want the numbers to just sink in with people who are listening, right? So you have 3 million users and a rating of 4.9. Okay, that's unheard of, right? I mean, I haven't heard of something like that before. So clearly, I mean, you're doing a lot of things right, right? Final couple of questions to you. So one is that you operate in the healthcare or medical space, and which means that you will have to plug into the broader ecosystem of organizations, like you mentioned, NHS, then there is therapists, and you also work with insurance companies, hospitals, or other providers, and so on. How do you integrate with this broader ecosystem, and what has that taught you as well?
Um, so broadly, we keep it at two levels. When you work with employers or people who are not diagnosed with an illness, we keep it anonymous. So there we are not trying to prove any outcomes on an individual basis. So we don't see any need for us to actually share an individual data of even usage with the partner. And therefore, most of them will have configured, we will configure it for the partner, like an employer, and the escalation would be based on their health system. So we might escalate to their behavioral health provider or their EAP service rather than the generic crisis helpline or whatever is local for their partners. And that escalation happens in many different ways in Wysa, as a part of conversation, as a part of a screen. So all of those places we'll create those custom pathways, and we'll create custom sort of onboarding permissions, things like that, that they need. We'll co-brand with them. And that's about it. That's the lighter version. That's the one that scales very easily. We were able to customize this for Accenture across 53 countries in 4 weeks. And each country, event managers, sending out webinars, etc. There's a whole campaign that goes around Wysa and these employers which engages people, takes them to a web version, and then gets down the app, because the app often, for people to download an app, it takes a lot. So, and there is that kind of integration. Then from a healthcare perspective, where we do research with people like, for instance, Washington University School of St. Louis, they will be running a program where we'll give them specific codes for specific people, and they'll be in their system, be able to track what the clinical outcomes of that person were after using Wysa, and we'll be only sending them usage data based on that code. So we still try to keep it where we don't have too much PII. But I think as we are now going forward, we are HIPAA compliant. So increasingly, we are having clients where we will be storing personally identifiable and personally sensitive data. But again, it's on a minimum sharing as needed. And we never share the actual conversations people have with Wysa. We only share broad, this person used this technique. So they used this technique 5 times, they came every day, their stress levels went up, down, this was the outcome, but not what they said.
Right. So I have a couple of questions on growth and monetization. Again, if product is a problem by itself, it's a very difficult problem to solve. Marketing is no less, right? Because again, you have to be very responsible in the sort of messages that you put out. You can't really do the brash sort of buy one, get one free or 30% off kind of kind of messaging, right? So, how is your marketing structured? So what is your strategy on that front? I mean, you mentioned app store optimization and so on. If you could, take us through broadly, what you do on the growth and marketing side of things.
There are two things. Of course, there's product growth, right? You run A/B experiments and you try to make sure that people come in, and you do app store optimizations. These are the two broad things that we do. So we tend to not do any Facebook ads. Wherever we are on Facebook or Instagram, it's about it being another channel for supporting people. So it's about being authentic, building the brand, and keeping it consistent with the Wysa feeling of wherever we meet you, we're going to be trying to help you. And so our Facebook presence is mainly a Facebook group of Wysa users who decided to work with each other, moderated with therapists. So it gives them that safe space, which is a closed private group where they talk to each other, much less marketing. Our right. Instagram is also very often filled with people who already use Wysa, as opposed to people who are we're trying to get into Wysa. So far, we have not done inorganic marketing. I think as we grow and we start on the next stage, the plan is to have licensed therapists in the US, where Ramakant and I have just moved, and in the UK. And at that stage, we already have, like if you type depression in the US App Store or therapy, Wysa will be one of the top apps that comes up. So being able to have licensed therapists there that insurance can pay for, and that then pays us enough to actually try to do some inorganic growth for that specific market. So there we'll probably have a growth strategy within organic growth for the first time in the 4 years Wysa's been around.
So that's actually very interesting. So you're using these platforms beyond acquisition itself to form a community around your category, essentially, right? Yeah, so that's really interesting. You mentioned in one of the talks that your next milestone is the 3 to 50 million user
Yeah.
sort of a milestone. How are you preparing for it? Anything that you would do differently going forward? You mentioned a couple right now, but anything you would add to that?
Language, I think, is big. So if we really want to make this accessible, and we once put out on Wysa for a few months that if people were typing in another language, we just asked them if they wanted to help us translate it into that language. And I think we ran that experiment for about 3-4 months, and we had over 100 people wanting us to translate in 30 languages. So there's a lot to be done in terms of language. We started out with Hindi. We tried out Hindi. We created a version of Wysa in Hindi. But now we're moving to Spanish because that is the top language that the users came back to us with. And we wanted to do Hindi because we all speak Hindi as the first language. And we wanted to learn how language works and doesn't work. And we learned a lot. We learned a lot about just the clinical safety in a language. And if you're going to do it in another language, we have to make sure that it's done right. So there are hacks in which you just translate your app and you let Google Translate handle whatever the user is saying and then run it through AI. And that we could probably cover every language in, 6 months. But we're trying to do it where we have psychologists who speak Spanish working with us to actually create a clinical safe AI, new models for each of that. And I think that just Spanish should be done in a few months now. And then we'll go on to the next language and so on. So language is going to be tough. It's not going to be one of those easy flip of a switch that we thought it would be just because of clinical safety. Voice is, in fact, for us, the next frontier. And the Google Assistant funding was a part of that. Again, with voice, we are waiting for the platforms to catch up a little bit. So we are ready. We've done all the prototypes, etc. We can stay in the wellness domain, but see, with voice, what happens is whatever the person says not just goes to our platform, but goes to whoever, like a Google Assistant or an Alexa platform. And you have to make sure that the data is safe there and it's private there. So we're now beginning to be a part of the sort of HIPAA compliant Alexa clouds and, wherever we can do stuff with Google, which doesn't take us into the clinical space. But our main strategy around voice is HIPAA compliant voice, so that we can actually help elders, for instance, who find it hard to text.
Right. I actually skipped over a question, but I thought I'd ask that anyway. While growth and engagement is one whole really difficult thing, and I think you've done fairly well on that front, I wanted to understand your experience on monetization. Again, a very sensitive issue, like you mentioned, right? I mean, you can't have half a conversation with someone and then prompt like a typical freemium sort of a pop-up saying that, hey, pay this much to continue or whatever, because the person could be in a very sensitive kind of a mode, right? So how do you think about monetization and what has your experience been on that front?
So I think with monetization, as with everything else, we want to create a sense of transparency with the user. So if anybody subscribes, does not like it, writes back to us, we immediately refund. So there's that sense that nobody's ever being trapped into paying for something, and they always have the alternative of the free app. So you're not leaving someone high and dry when they've just opened up to you and said that they need all this help. So the first decision around monetization is what to monetize. And as a group, we did not want to monetize, 3 days in, that person's got used to talking to you and then say, now you can't talk to Wysa anymore. We wanted Wysa to be a friend, and a friend doesn't charge you money. So that Wysa, the friend, will always be free. Then we said, yes, but they're libraries. So somebody wants to access everything of Wysa without arriving at it through conversation, but wants to browse and see, oh, there's a relationship pack, and I have these 10 tools I can do to improve my relationships or improve my self-esteem. Or you can get all of those packs in Wysa as a part of the premium pack, for X per month. So it's not huge. It's not a very expensive thing. And so Then we said, okay, let's add therapists, and we have in-house therapists. We still make it affordable, but we also redesign it so that it works really well, and uh, and then make that something people can pay for. So once we were comfortable having things that we were comfortable people paying for, then all the regular stuff happens, right? You give them a free trial, you ask them, do you want to work on this yourself? You want to work on this with another person? And depending on which they answer, you either offer them Wysa Premium or Wysa Therapist.
Fantastic. This has been a fascinating conversation, Joe, and I know we are, past our time. One final question to you. You've done so much and you've been through so much, right? So when you look back on your journey with everything that you've done up until now, how do you connect some of these dots looking back, and, what are some underlying themes of this journey?
I think the values have stayed really consistent of keeping it real, of not telling yourself a story, not telling the world a story, and being able to look the radical candor that we practice both as an organization and to ourselves. Um, the value of seeing the truth and the value of changing direction when you're wrong. I think listening, that has stayed constant. Um, there has definitely been fatigue that has set in from time to time, and then somehow Wysa does something. Someone will come, someone will join us. It's been our best recruiter. It's found clients for us. It's found advisors for us. People use it. They're like, everybody needs this. How can I help you? And they'll write to us, and or somebody will turn around and tell us how much of a difference it's made in their lives, and it will just give us that energy back. So I don't know if I want to sort of draw any kind of conclusion, because I think we're very far from a conclusion. I would just say so far so good. Right. We've stayed alive, we've made some impact.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate this, and this was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you, Roshan, for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform, and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.